গৌরব বোধ করছি এবং খুব আগ্রহ নিয়ে অপেক্ষা করছি, কারণ আমরা এমন একজনকে পেয়েছি আজকে আমাদের মাঝখানে। তিনি অনেক দূর থেকে এসেছেন, সে আমরা ছোটবেলা থেকে যে পড়ে আসছি সাম্য, মৈত্রী, স্বাধীনতা, সেই দেশ থেকে। তিনি হচ্ছেন Guillaume Bridet, উনি অধ্যাপক, সরবন বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়, প্যারিস। আর ওনার বিশেষ চর্চার বিষয় হচ্ছে বিংশ শতক এবং একবিংশ শতকের ফরাসি সাহিত্য। আমরা রবীন্দ্রনাথকে বলি বিশ্বকবি, ঠিক সেই কথাটির প্রমাণ করতেই যেন উনি আজকে এসেছেন আমাদের মাঝখানে। ওনার সম্পর্কে পরে আরো বলছি আমি কথা, কিন্তু আমাদের শুরুটি বেঁধে দিচ্ছে আজকে আমাদের ইনস্টিটিউটের সকলের আদরের শ্রয়ণ বসু। উনি একটি রবীন্দ্রসঙ্গীত দিয়ে আজকের অনুষ্ঠান শুরু করছে।
আজি যত তারা তব আকাশে, আজি যত তারা তব আকাশে, সবে মোর প্রাণ ভরি প্রকাশে। আজি যত তারা তব আকাশে, নিখিল তোমার এসেছে ছুটিয়া, মোর মাঝে আজি পড়েছে টুটিয়া। হে তবনি কুঞ্জের মঞ্জরি যত আমারি অঙ্গে বিকাশে। আজি যত তারা তব আকাশে, আজি যত তারা তব আকাশে। দিকে দিগন্তে যত আনন্দ রহিয়াছে, এক গভীর গন্ধ আমার চিত্তে মিলিয়ে একত্রে তোমার মন্দিরে উচ্ছ্বাসে। আজি কোন ক্ষণে কারেও না জানি, শুনিতে না পাই আজি কারো বাণী। হে নিখিল নিঃশ্বাস আজি এ বক্ষে, মা শরীর সুরে বিকাশে। আজি যত তারা তব আকাশে, আজি যত তারা তব আকাশে, সবে মোর প্রাণ ভরি প্রকাশে। আজি যত তারা তব আকাশে।
আমরা আলোচনা শুরুর আগে ওই গান শোনার তার যেমন বেঁধে নিতে হয়, সেরকম আরেকটি গানও শুনবো, সুপর্ণা মজুমদারের কণ্ঠে। চেষ্টা করছি সেই উপযোগী একটা গান।
Oh
Good evening. On behalf of the members of Tagore Research Institute and all Tagore devotees, I welcome Guillaume Bridet here, who has come a long way to talk to us about Tagore. He has come from the land of, as you heard from our childhood days, the land of equality, fraternity and liberty. He is a professor of Sorbonne University, Paris, and his specialization is in 20th century and 21st century French literature. And we would like to know, like to hear from him, how and why and when he was attracted towards Tagore literature. He had come to us, our country, not this institution, visited various institutions associated with Tagore and Vishwabharati University, and his research on Tagore had the outcome of a book. The name of the book in Bengali I know, Bharater Aina Visho. Kanchana, what is the English name?
There is no English translation.
Oh, acha.
Author naam Rabindranath Tagore. Bharat Aina Visho.
Okay, and he translated Tagore's book, Nationalism, into French. So we are eagerly and most excitedly waiting to hear from him, and the subject is, quite interestingly, Tagore and Europe, recognition and misunderstanding, which is an interesting topic in today's world of binaries. The world today we live in is a world of binaries, so it's a fitting topic, I think. Okay, Professor Bridet.
Thank you very much.
Would you like to have any? No?
No, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you for your welcoming. And thank you for your coming, especially with that weather, which is not very easy for a lot of us. And it's a great honor for me to speak in front of you, especially in India and in that center, because you know Tagore much better than I can. And I would like to thank, first of all, Kanchana Mukhopadhyay, who translates in English the book I wrote. I would like to talk today to Rabindranath Tagore, who remains a major figure in the literature of Bengal, who continues to shine in Bangladesh and India today, but which is quite forgotten today in Europe. I'm sorry to say that. It's quite forgotten today. But it was not the same. It was not true in 1 century ago. Exactly 1 century ago, Tagore was, you know that, of course, immensely famous, not only in the Indian Empire, but throughout Europe, and even the world, to the point of being the first living Asian to enjoy truly international literary fame, and the first to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. And I think that to appreciate the meaning of the occasion, the meaning of this prize, we only need to recall two facts. First of all, in 1907, it was a champion of British colonization, Rudyard Kipling, also born in India, but in a British family, who had received the prize. And then it was until 1968 that another Asian writer, the Japanese Yasunori Kawabata, who received the Nobel Prize in his turn for 55 years after Tagore. It's a very long time to honor as again, the second time. The fame of Tagore and his work in Europe during the first decades of the 20th century has given rise to many studies in India and abroad that are, to say the least, mixed in terms of the actual degree of recognition it reflects. Whether inspired by by Edward Said, Edward Said, critique of Orientalism, such as Bika Chakrabarty, or by the Bourdieusian Pierre Bourdieu, critique of symbolic domination, such as Pascal Casanova, the French writer. Many authors consider that the recognition of the Bengali poet was a fool's game. And it was the case even for Amit Chaudhuri, who writes also very strong words about Tagore. His poetic singularity and cultural roots would have been in need, and he would have been reduced either to an Indian nourished by spiritualist platitudes that obscured the threat to English imperialism in his work, or to a cosmopolitan at the expense of his own culture, to the point of illustrating the acculturation of the Indian upper class and the obvious success of English colonization in the field of education. But I think that these two ways of looking at Tagore's presence in Europe seems to me caricatures. The European translation and reception of Tagore remain complex phenomena that are subject of multiple mediations. It should be added that Tagore was not simply read in Europe, and that he himself did not address European alone. That, I think, is very important. He also addressed his thoughts to India, to Asia, and to the global world. On top of all that, at the same time, the poet himself is far from passive, symbolically orientalist or dominated in this process. He has an idea of India, of Europe, of the world, that he wants to transmit to his readers. And that's what I would like to show in this talk. And I look at 3 points in turn, and I start now with my first point, my first section, whose title is From England and English to the rest of Europe and other European languages. This is my first point. It was with Song Offerings, a collection of poems translated by the poet himself from Bengali into English, that Tagore's works began to appear in England. First in a limited edition published by the India Society in November 1912, then in an edition for the general public published by Macmillan in March of the following year. Even before the Nobel Prize in 1930, the number of titles in English increased, with the poetry collections The Gardener and The Crescent Moon, the play Chitwa, and the collection of essays Sadhana. However, it was mainly as a result of the prize that the writer became known and that his work spread rapidly across all Europe. I just give you one element precisely. From a quantitative point of view, Tagore's translations represented a large-scale movement on the continent. By the way, between 1913 and 1919, just in 6 years, Gallimard, the NRF, Nouvelle Revue Française, sold 6,600 copies of L'Offrande Lyrique. This is the name of the translation of Gitanjali by the famous French writer André Gide, and which put the collections in 6th place in the house sales and made it the only poetic work and the only work of a foreign origin among the top 10 bestsellers of the 1910s. So it was really an event in the French literary cycles. His travels around the continent made him even more famous in the 20s, just 10 years after. Many great people met him. Henri Bergson, a philosopher in France, Albert Einstein in Germany, Benedetto Croce in Italy. A wide audience listened to his lectures at the University of Strasbourg, at the University of Berlin in Oxford. And people went to the exhibition of his paintings, that of course in Paris, London, Berlin, and Moscow at the beginning of the 30s. And attended the many performances of his plays. Tagore even inspired some poets and writers, like the Spaniard Juan Ramon Jimenez, the German Hermann Hesse, and composer, very famous European composer, yes, like the Czech Leos Janáček, the Frenchman Darius Milhaud, and the Austrian Alexander Zelinsky. The first noteworthy fact is that this distribution usually takes place in 2 stages, from India to England, and then from England to countries on the continent. It therefore involves at least 3 languages: Bengali, English, and another European language. Direct translations from Bengali into a continental language are rare. Only one, by the way, in French, during the 10th and 20th and 30th. It's not much. It was even not uncommon for a 4th language to be inserted between Bengali, English, and the Tagore language. By the way, in Bulgaria, the translations from Bengali to Bulgaria came from French, from English, from German, from Russia. So I think it's every time another Tagore which reach the readers, not the same. Tagore himself undertook this translation process in order to reach a wider audience, which required a shift from a local to an international language, a shift that also corresponded to the shift from the mother tongue to the language of the colonial power. But I think that he made the switch to English without any illusion of what it would be possible to translate, which is one of the reasons why, rather than domination, we should speak of an acute sense of symbolic negotiation and of the possibilities offered by the state of literature in Europe. I think he made his own translation knowing very precisely what he was doing and not being dominated by the European public and readers. And that's what I would like to show. Tagore exercised this sense of cultural opportunity, first and foremost in the translation of his poems, by simplifying his language for an audience that he knew to be different from the Bengali public. On the one hand, the removal of all too precise allusions to Hindu culture makes it easier for Western readers to understand and gives the poems a universal aspect. On the other hand, the choice of prose instead of verse and a broader prosaization leads the poet to limit the song aspect of his poems, very important in Bengal, of course, but maybe not in the field of European poetry. In particular, by deleting numerous repetitions and by merging several poems into a single one. By ephemizing anything that might be too oriental in his poetry, purifying it of its most obvious vernacular features, while leaving a sufficient halo of spirituality for its strangeness to remain. Tagore proceeds like Kafka, proceeds like Beckett, or like Borges, Borges. He follows a concerted strategy of deprovincializing and universalizing his work. The fact that the language and style chosen were those of the colonial power was less important to him than the possibility of gaining access to a new readership. And the Indian writer made the switch without saving to publish in Bengali, remaining for the rest of his life an author writing in two languages. Added to this was the fact that he himself played on his image as an Oriental wise man to establish his authority and influence over his European interlocutors. The impassive old man with the straight nose and long white beard, dressed in his light-colored tunic and speaking with nobility and as if inspired by the divine, as he appears in a number of portraits. He's not just a Western production. That's what we can read in the critic. But I don't think it's true. It is at least an Indo-Western co-production. It corresponds on the one hand, and with no doubt, to an Orientalist production of Europe, of course. But although, on the other hand, to Tagore's conviction of an Oriental message that should be delivered to the West. This, at least, relative programming by Tagore himself of this European reception should not, however, lead us to conceal the fundamental role played by the different national context, which is very important in Europe. Generally, at the time, generally speaking, the sur-imposition of translations implies a time lag between English publications and continental publications. And this delay, which can last from a few years to more than 2 decades, is not without consequence. The first wave of translation of Tagore's works into English took place in 1912, and continental retranslations began the following year. But the First World War, which broke out a year later, brought the process to an abrupt break until the end of the conflict. So, the European context was then transformed in many ways. The triumphant Europe of after World War I was not the Europe of the early 20s, both impoverished and shaken in its global domination and in the foundations of its civilizations. The reception of Tagore's work was also absolutely transformed. When he arrived in London in June 1912 and was introduced by the painter and art critic William Rosenstein, who had met him in Bengal a year before, Tagore almost immediately became the center of attraction for England's most influential literary elites. He made friends, like his Yeats, his Rapins. He was introduced to Bertrand Russell, George Bernard Shaw, T.A. Lawrence, etc., etc. And England was then at the height of its imperial power, and more broadly, Europe reigned over the world. Tagore's reception was strongly influenced by this context, which led some to reject him because he was Indian, and others to accept him by anglicizing and Europeanizing him. At that time, Gitanjali was read not as an Indian collection, but as an English collection, in which the East converged with the West to demonstrate the existence of a universal culture, but still with a predominantly Western flavor, you can see. In their respective introduction to the collection, both the Irish poet William Butler Yeats and the French writer André Gide succumbed to this idea. For the most part, they failed to situate Tagore, and they don't want to situate Tagore in his own Indian context. And this Indian context, doesn't interest them at all. They very vaguely place his poetry in the English context, under the sign of sacredness, and they consider it to be the living testimony of his civilization where the breakup of modernity has not yet taken place. Their aim was the same, to learn on Tagore's spirituality, but without knowing nothing about that, so that Europe will be able to rediscover the thrill of his history and reconnect with his lost past. So rediscovering the past of Europe, passing through India, that's the way they were thinking. But after the First World War, Tagore's reception declined dramatically in England. and that for many reasons. But I think the main explanation was political. Before the war, Tagore presented a faith that did not offend British imperialism. Although in 1905 he had opposed Lord Curzon's partition of Bengal, he gradually withdrew from politics and dissociated himself from the nationalist actions of his compatriots, whom he considered too hostile to the West. In his view, collaboration between East and West was the condition for India's future independence. The lectures in English collected in Nationalism in 1917, in which he radically criticized European nationalism, constituted an initial break with these somewhat boring images. 2 years later, following the murder of several hundred Indians by British troops in Amritsar, Tagore renounced the knighthood he had been awarded by the British Crown in 1915, and the opinion of the imperial power became more hostile to him. But the situation was quite different on the European continent, whose countries were more detached from political affairs concerning India. Tagore's popularity, still in its infancy before 1914 and suspended in the year that followed, spread to its full extent, while the image of Tagore as a mystical poet was doubled by that of Tagore as an intellectual. This new context generated a rise to extremes between admirers and critics of the poet. Tagore was all the more violently taken to task as Europe was in crisis, and the national reflex led to the rejection of this Asian writer to serve as a threat to the national spirit and as a ferment of decadence. At the same time, a space for discussion remains open. Writers and intellectuals of Europe were even more likely to hear Tagore's message, or what they perceived to be his message, because with the war, the civilization of the Enlightenment had produced its opposite side of barbarism. This particular context of crisis produced an appel to the East. In French, we say les appels de l'Orient. Les appels de l'Orient. An appel to the East. And Tagore enjoyed remarkable success in almost all the countries. But the precise condition of this recognition remained complex and nourished by the very dramatical European history at the time. That's what I would like to explain in the second moment of my talk. And I give a title to this second moment. The title is that one: Cultural Transfers and Cross-Mediations, Tagore between England, France, and Germany. Okay, I cannot talk about all the countries of Europe, but I take the three important countries at that time: France, England, and Germany. The Indian writer is not read. The European reception of Tagore undergoes specific inflections according to different national contexts. The Indian writer is not read directly from a source country, India, to a target country, let's say France or Germany or England, but through a series of cultural and political mediations involving one or more countries into which he is also translated. For example, Tagore's reception in France cannot be understood without taking into account the fact that India was a British colony and that the poet recited triumphant welcome in Germany, and more broadly, that a terrible war had just torn Europe apart. I would like to give you more details about this process. The warm welcome given to Tagore in English modernist cycles in 1912 and 13 first aroused a certain attraction in French modernist cycles, strongly marked by English influence. There was a strong English aesthetic influence in French just before First War I. Both groups in French and in England share the same concern for spiritualist revival in the context of a renewal of poetic forms, free from all political considerations. This was particularly true of certain writers in the highly Anglophile Nouvelle Revue Française, such as Valéry Larbaud, Jean Schlumberger, the famous French poet Saint John Perse, maybe you know Saint John Perse, which was awarded the Nobel Prize at the beginning of the years after. And above all, André Gide, which is the main French writer at the time, who, in his preface to Le Front Lyrique, ends by concluding, I quote André Gide about Tagore's poetry. I don't think I know of a more solemn and beautiful accent in any literature. While the INRF, while the Nouvelle Revue Française, distanced himself from Tagore at the time of his politicization after the war, and the cooling of his reception in Great Britain after the war, the anti-colonialist and internationalist circles in France gathered around the French review Europe. It is the name of a review, Europe, a very famous review during the 20s in France, and even today. So, this review and this intellectual cycle around the review then take over the interest of Tagore. These writers, and mainly Romain Rolland, consider the Indian poet as an apostle of peace, hostile to all nationalism, a figure who was both critical and reconciling, preserving beyond the European war and the relationship of colonial domination, the possibility of dialogue between the peoples of Europe and between civilizations. Romain Rolland contrasted Gandhi, who was too one-sided in his rejection of the West contribution to human civilization, and who exacerbated, in his mind anyway, the nationalism that he considered potentially dangerous. So he contrasted Gandhi with Tagore, for whom exchanges between East and West should be based on a form of recognition and reciprocity. I quote Romain Rolland. Gandhi is a medieval universalist. It's a strong formulation. We could speak a long time, I think. So Gandhi is a medieval universalist. While venerating him, and you know he wrote a book on Gandhi, we are with Tagore. So we prefer Tagore to Gandhi. French nationalist cycles, which is another part of the elite intellectual, the French elite intellectual, the French nationalist circles criticize the Indian poet for the same reason the leftists admire him, which is quite strange. For them, Tagore was very much established in relation to what was happening on the east border of France. So the east border of France is, of course, Germany. The fact that, I quote, Tagore is nowhere better received than in the New Germany speaks indeed against him, definitely. The far-right thinker Henri Massis, I don't know if you know him, but it's quite important in France those days. Henri Massis just makes extremely rapid comparison which bring together in the same detestation of Asia figures as different as Tagore, Gandhi, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, all in the same, the same pocket, who, in his view, relate the romanticism of German thinkers as Shelley, Schopenhauer, or Nietzsche, even more than against an Indian Tagore. Massis, Henri Massis, shows his rejection of a German Tagore. It was likely up to him, Tagore was like a German, which is the worst possible to be in France, in that kind of intellectual circles. So his rejection of a German Tagore belonging to a Germany, I quote, Germany was, to his eyes, in the India of Europe. Germany, India of Europe. So India begins just across the border. This is the beginning of India, in his mind. The gateway to barbarism on the continent, against which France has to protect itself. The Roman Catholic France has to defend itself. If we turn the tables, the same kind of complex process is at work in Tagore's reception in Germany, marked by the war that had just ended. On the one hand, Tagore was perceived as an enemy of England, and this contributed to his popularity, because Germany and England was enemy. Of course, they were enemy. Tagore was, as in France in the 20s, he was appreciated in Germany as the bearer of a renewed spirituality. But this spirituality was different. Not Germany and France are different spiritualities. Because the German spirituality was directed less toward the reconciliation of people, as in France, than toward the patriotic exaltation of a defeated country. This was the case with Hermann Kesselring, who wanted to renew German culture through pagan contact with nature. In the eyes of the German philosopher, Tagore, I quote, was a creator comparable to the ancient, to the old bards who, at the finished saga, tell us, song about all of the forest and the stars. This is not the French Tagore. This is a German Tagore, quite different. I'm not sure it's an Indian Tagore, but this is a German Tagore. This Tagore is a man whose song is essentially music, and who is therefore deeply rooted in the people to whom he belongs, just as the German national anthem is rooted in the heart of the young Germans who sing it to Tagore during his visit in June 1921 to a forest near Darmstadt in Germany. On the other hand, however, his status as a writer, still open to England, limited his reception by members of the nationalist right in Germany. a certain section of the German press reproached Tagore for his Indianness. Sometimes he was presented as an Hindu who was trying to influence Christians like a snake, you know. Tagore was a snake in some text. In Germany, even in France, presented like a snake, who tried to influence Christians in their faith and convert them to Hinduism, sometimes as an invader controlled by England, who was taking the place of talented German writers. There was a polemic when he received the Nobel Prize in Germany about if it's possible to choose an Indian writer and not a German one. And finally, he was perceived as a lethargic Oriental whose apathy was undermining the necessary national renaissance of Germany. At the very beginning of the 20s, the future Nazi leader, Joseph Goebbels, may have succumbed to the allure of the Sage from faraway India. At that time, he seemed to him the bearer of a useful anti-rationalism, which Tagore was not. It's another thing. An anti-rationalism in the fight against the Enlightenment. But he soon came to see him as just another figure of Anglo-Saxon liberalism. When Hitler came to power, Tagore's works was no longer welcome in Germany. His paintings and drawings were classified as degenerate art. Tagore himself, partly, he was conscious of this complex process of revolution in different countries, and he tried on his own way to react and to be active in that process. And he partly grasped the national and international dynamics of his reception and tried to control its effects. It was not easy for him as an Indian. By refocusing it on his relationship with a specific country he was addressing. The aim of here is to renationalize reception on a bilateral way, in order to avoid any parasitic European mediation. So to be read directly by French, by English, by German, without all this complication. By the way, during his journey through war-torn Champagne, Champagne is a place north of France, absolutely destroyed by the war. He called for forgiveness that will elevate France. I mean, France should forgive Germany for all those destructions. But he made the same. He made a symmetrical glorification of Germany when he visited Germany. I quote, "If it be the destiny of Germany to go through the penance of the sin of the modern age and come and purified and strong, she will be blessed with the history of humanity." Those statements should not be seen as a form of opportunism, of hypocrisy. Forgiveness is a Christian value and should be a French one in his eyes. Tagore is speaking of Germany as a nation from a consolatory perspective. He does so by at least tacitly adopting here again the Christian model of atonement that would enable the defeated country not just to rise individually, but to take the lead among nations in the necessary break with cannibalistic modernity. Tagore did not reserve this type of cultural or spiritual diplomacy for France and Germany alone. He did the same in almost all the countries where he had a journey. The process of attracting the benevolent attentions of one's interlocutor was also present in 1939 when the Pole Marina Falk, then a lecturer in Slavic languages at the University of Calcutta, founded an Indo-Polish association, the aim of which was to provide assistance to Polish refugees in India. Tagore agreed to be its honorary president and gave an inaugural speech in which he specifically saluted, I quote, the Polish people with whom we share common Aryan traditions. Common Aryan tradition between Poland and India. It was of little importance to the Indian poet that the German Nazis, at the same time, regarded the Poles not as Aryan, but as slaves, who deserved nothing more than to be enslaved. His thinking was not rooted in the history of European countries, but he tries to establish special links with each of them, with France, with Germany, or on another occasion with Poland, or Russia, or Spain, or even Italy. And it's this last country that I'd like to focus on now for my last point. For the last part of my talk, it relates to us to understand the way Tagore viewed Europe, India, and the world. So Tagore on Italy is a complex question. You know the story. After founding the International University of Shantiniketan in Bengal, Tagore decided to travel and to publicize the institution and find sources of funding. It was essentially for this purpose that he undertook several trips around the world. And it was in this context that he first visited Italy in January 1925. Tagore made contact with Carlo Formici, professor of Sanskrit at the University of Rome, who accepted his invitation to come to Shantiniketan and who came with 500 books in Italian, which Mussolini donated to the library of the institution. He announced also the forthcoming era of Professor Tucci, a talented Gobi Indianist who stayed Italy agreed to pay for an entire year. In return, Tagore was officially invited by the Italian government for another visit to the peninsula, which took place in June 1926. And this is this visit which is problematic. The official welcome given to the Indian poet by the fascist regime and by the Dutch himself caused astonishment not only among liberal Italians, but also among his internationalist friends in other European countries, and especially in France. It took all the strength of conviction of Romain Rolland and a meeting with Italian political exiles to convince Tagore to publicly condemn fascism in an article in the Manchester Guardian in August 1926, which was quickly translated into many other newspapers all over the world. Hosting the Nobel Prize had been a way for the fascist regime to embarrass England in India, and above all, to mask the harsh international repression of its opponents and improve its image. Tagore's subsequent distancing of himself from the regime provoked reaction of spite in the Italian press. And the Indian poet found himself treated as an ingrate and denigrated as much as he had been treated. It makes little sense to think that Tagore had any affinity whatsoever with fascism. His very clear statements against fascism and Nazism throughout the 30s, and his letter to President Roosevelt in 1914 would suffice to prove this. What remains, however, is to explain this Italian visit, which is generally considered to be a faux pas. Many arguments have been put forward of all kinds, and I just want to point another explanation, which up to me is very important. An explanation that has remained largely obscure, and to understand it, we can quote an article by Kalidashnath, forgive my pronunciation, please, on the occasion of Professor Formichi's visit to Shantiniketan. I quote Kalidashnath. What gives a special character to the coming of Professor Carlo Formici of Rome to Shantiniketan is the fact that he comes not simply as a scholar sent by some academic group or a learned body, but that he is deputed by the whole people of Italy through their far-famed Premier Mussolini. And I think this is the main point. What we read here is not just a hint of diplomatic worldliness or self-serving submission, but Indian national pride. Two agendas collide with each other. Two historical chronologies and two geographical frameworks. Nag and Tagore saw in Mussolini less the fascist leader than the head of state of a great nation, and less the Italian as such as the European leader. That's why the recognition they accorded him in return had to be understood less on a national scale than on an imperial one. For them, for Tagore and Nag, it mattered little that Italy had been ruled for a year and a half by fascists following a coup d'etat. It's strange for Europeans to think that, but I think it's true. Not to me anyway. But what was of little importance to them, less precisely at the edge of the political situation from the point of view of Europeans. Misunderstanding. And what was of the greatest interest to them, to the Indian, was largely invisible from Europe, I think. The recognition of the high cultural value of a colonized country, not by individuals like Sylvain Lévy or Ronaldo, but by the heads of states of a country that was also, like England, a colonizing country in Africa. While Europeans take their positions essentially on the basis of rivalries between various European nations, which have not yet calmed down in the wreck of the First World War, the two Indians framed their discourse in the multi-century history of empires. The former continue to write the history of what remains at the center and which will lead to the Second World War, while the latter are still in the coup d'avant and the coup d'après. and already linking the emergence of European world domination in the 16th century to the great wave of decolonizations between 1947 and 1974. Both see a world in crisis, but neither the world they build nor the historical moments in which they place it are the same. And that's the main point, actually. Beyond these conjunctures, perceived differently here and there, we must turn to Tagore's thinking on nations. The fact is that nation, to say the least, is not the preferred framework for his political thought. I quote Tagore, "I'm not against one nation in particular, but against the general idea of all nations." It was not just that he condemned the aggressive and violent excesses of nationalism. More profoundly, in his eyes, the nation is intimately linked to the state. And the state is an impersonal and liberticidal institution that transforms individuals into interchangeable cogs in an enormous machine. It places them at the service of its efficiency and of its power, rather than encouraging their development in the sphere of art and morality. This ethical and political point of view, which leads to a radical critique of the entire Western modernity and of the entire dominant narrative of European nations, has fundamental implications for the audience to whom Tagore addresses his discourses. He does not deploy his thought on the scale of nations, but he restricts it and overflows it on the scale of the entire human race and of each individual taken in particular. He was therefore an internationalist favoring rapprochement between peoples more than states, and a cosmopolitan working to bring individual consciousness closer together and to build a new humanity. The Vishva Bharati project and Tagore's travels for publicity and funding purpose must be revisited. The poet traveled not only in Europe, but all over the world. These movements in space also reflect a situation in several history. Tagore's university certainly has a national aim to take India out of its status as an object dominated by Western knowledge, to put the country on the map of the scientific and intellectual world, and to transform it into a contemporary interlocutor worthy of respect. And this is very important. But its longer-term aim goes far beyond this. And it is here that various non-exclusive scales of India's relationship with the outside world converge. First of all, there is a scale of Asia manifested in the desire to establish a research and teaching center that would enable Asians to meet, to become aware of their common history, and reflect on their contribution to future humanity. There is also, though and above all, the planetary scale, which should enable the whole world to converge in India, while India would also radiate out to the whole world in the process of reciprocal integration concerning all peoples and all individuals on the globe. facing the same major issues. And I think this is a point that makes Tagore our contemporary, well, a very contemporary writer. For Tagore, at the end of the day, and this type of statement obviously gave rise to a certain misunderstanding even in India, I think, mainly in India. For Tagore, I think India belonged to no one. And it did not matter whether it was governed by Great Britain or whether it was sovereign. It was important, but at the same way, not so much important. What mattered was what the British were actually doing in India and what the Indians would do if they became independent. Tagore wanted all these reflections ultimately mean that notion like East, spiritual East, or West, materialistic West, taught me much, for instance. Because people are the same everywhere, and ties that bind them to each other are many. European imperialism is certainly the enemy, of course. But what should be opposed to it is not Indian nationalism. And even what should be opposed to the colonial state is not essentially an Indian state, but a revitalized Indian society at village level. Like other Indian or European institutions of the same period, and we could write a history of that kind of a world history of that kind of institutions. Vishwabharati has links with Gandhi, Sabarmati, Ashram in Gujarat, with Hermann von Kesselring, Schule der Weisheit in Darmstadt, or with the Walden colony founded by Frederick von Eden in the Netherlands. Tagore University constructs thus a society within the society, a utopian place that enables the development of a new modernity and constitutes the seeds of a new India and, more importantly, a new humanity, where each individual could achieve full self-development. From this point of view, what is happening in Santiniketan is also part of a global history of human renewal. Its rural setting is no coincidence, since it provides an opportunity on the fringe of the great imperial centers of Europe, but also of the great cosmopolitan city of Calcutta, to forge links between educated urban dwellers and peasants from the countryside, between recent settlements and Santal tribes, long established in the region, and between humanity as a whole and the nature that surrounds it. Here again, Tagore is in the aftermath. What he is calling for is greater cooperation that is not so much between states as between societies, between individuals, between living beings, all linked to each other and to the earth that support them. We are no longer talking about Europe here, or even about India, but about humanity as a whole. And it is ultimately in this difference of scale that lie the greatest misunderstandings of which Tagore put the object in Europe 1 century ago, as well, no doubt, of the reflections that he provokes today as regards the writing of history and the destiny of humanity. And let me finish by reading a few beautiful sentences that Tagore wrote shortly before he died, at one of the worst moments in human history, in the spring of 1941. 2 sentences that I read. But you know these sentences, but I like them very much, but I would like to share them with you. As I look around, I see the crumbling ruins of a proud civilization strewn like a vast heap of futility. And yet, I shall not commit the grievous sin of losing faith in man. I would rather look forward to the opening of a new chapter in his history after the cataclysm is over and the atmosphere rendered clean with a spirit of service and sacrifice. Thank you for your attention.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Logical, fact-based analysis of the transformation of the acquisition of Tagore as an apostle of peace and the dramatic decline as he stated, due to political reasons of course, and finally the message, the actual message, the real message of Tagore towards the world. Our heartfelt thanks to Prof. Bridet, and one thing we have to mention, our heartfelt thanks, our sincerest thanks to Dr. Kanchana Mukhopadhyay, actually who was instrumental. She was instrumental in bringing Prof. Bridet here, and the book I mentioned in the introduction, the book by Prof. Bridet had been translated into Bengali by Professor Kanchana Mukherjee, and this is available here. You can buy it if you like. It's over there. And you can put questions to the speaker, whichever language you prefer. There is Dr. Kanchana to translate in your mother tongue, in English, or in French if you like. He is there ready to answer your queries. Would you like to ask him something? Anyone? Actually, when I was listening to her, I was reminded of a very interesting coincidence. Today is 1st of August, and I was reminded of a letter written to Andrews by Tagore. That was, I don't exactly remember the date, but it was in the early of August. And Tagore was shocked, disheartened, very much upset, and he wrote that your public, that is the English public and English Parliament, their attitude towards India, I don't exactly remember the words, but these two words he used was one of contempt and callousness. And so he had to leave England, actually he did, and by maybe the first week of August, he went to France, and he said that I am very much relieved coming here. That I was reminded of. So, any question? Anyone? Yes, Anjana? Yes, please come here. You come here. No, please come here.
This is a question to Professor Bridet. We have mentioned about the deprovincialization. Actually, for us, deprovincialization is something different. So I exactly wanted to understand what do you mean by deprovincialization?
I don't assume this word on my point of view, but I think it was a strategy. You know that it could not be decided as an Indian. It was not possible to introduce the Indian cultures at the earth of Europe at that time. So it doesn't perceive itself as a provincial, of course. But we know that European perceive it as a provincial. So he made a process of deprovinciality for his European readers. It's a strategy. I think it's a strategy. Like Kafka, many writers which are not European done the same in the 20th century, all around the world. They can write for their own public, for their local public. But I mean, the Geiger local public is a huge one. It's not province, not provincial. But they can write for their public or they can write for abroad, I mean for the West. It's two different strategies. And he managed to do I think he managed to do both of them.
Yeah, I understand. You wanted to highlight his Indian entity rather than localized entity. That's what you want to be.
The main point for me is because when you write a scientist in France, or like when I read books on Tagore, most of the time the researchers present him like someone who was dominated by the war, who lose his soul in the localization. Localization was a lose for him. And I think it's not exactly that. I think he is on board and drives the car. Tries it. It's a negotiation, and he knows what he was doing, and without too much illusionism. And especially about translations, which he didn't think that he was doing magnificent translations. I don't think so. And I don't think it's interesting to criticize the English translations in him, because for him, it was just a way to reach new readers. I think it was this, and not he was not, he thought, he knew it was not possible to translate in English the Bengali poetry.
This is my impression too, that now we are talking so much about Indian English literature, but he was the founder of Indian English literature because he not only translated his poems, but he has written it, keeping all the Indian aspects. Yeah. So in my opinion, he is the founder that many people may disagree with me, but in my opinion, he is the founder of Indian English literature in that sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So as is the custom with us, we end the session with a Tagore song.
সকলে বসে উঠতে হবে পরশ মনে ছোঁয়া প্রাণে হে জীবন পূর্ণ করো, হে জীবন পূর্ণ করো, হে জীবন পূর্ণ করো, হে জীবন পূর্ণ করো বহন দানে, আগুনে পরশ মনি ছোঁয়া প্রাণে, আমারি দেহ খানি তুলে ধরো, তোমারই দেবালয়ে প্রদীপ করো, আমারি দেহ খানি তুলে ধরো, তোমারই দেবালয়ে প্রদীপ করো, নিশিদিন আলো শিখা জ্বলুক দানে, নিশিদিন আলো শিখা জ্বলুক দানে, দাঁড়ে সব সারা রাত ফোটাক তারা নব নব নয়নের দৃষ্টি হতে ঘুষবে আলো যেখানে পড়বে সেথায় দেখবে আলো নয়নের দৃষ্টি হতে ঘুষবে আলো যেখানে পড়বে সেথায় দেখবে আলো ব্যথা মোর উঠবে জ্বলে ঊর্ধ্বপানে ব্যথা মোর উঠবে জ্বলে ঊর্ধ্বপানে আগুনের পরশমণি ছোঁয়াও প্রাণে এ জীবন পূর্ণ